When you're traveling, you have those dreams of home. What you want to do. David says, I wish I could get a drink of water from my well. 3 of his biggest fighters get behind the enemy ranks, get to that well, fill up a pitcher, come back to him. Ta-da! Want a drink, David? And David is about to pour it, and he says, where do you boys get this from? So David, it's from your well in Bethlehem. So how do you do it? So we snuck behind enemy lines. You guys put your life in jeopardy? Yes, sir. We admire you. We love you. Want you to have it. David's about to put it to his mouth, takes it down, pours it onto the ground and says, I cannot jeopardize the sacred right of another person to enjoy something for my pleasure. If he had reacted the same way when he saw Bathsheba, all of Old Testament history would have been different. Ladies and gentlemen, especially to you gentlemen, I want to say this. We need to know where our boundaries are, where the lines are that we need to draw, what is sacred, what is fulfilling, and I know whereof I speak. 4 decades on the road and the temptations never diminish. There's always somebody who wants to buy you. There's always somebody who wants you to cross a boundary. And as Chesterton said, whenever you remove any fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put up there in the first place. Think about that. And so I ask you, are there boundaries you have set up beyond which you will not cross? That's what really makes the leader who can mentor the younger ones so that the younger ones can look up to them and say, that man or that woman is my leader, knew what lines not to cross. I've seen this happen again and again in both directions. You know, most of India's leaders who hosted the Commonwealth Games are in jail today because they were bought. They were bought. In Hindi, they say, "Mej ke niche," under the table. It's under the table. It's under the table. When I was in France having dinner with the leader of their business school and the head of Carrefour, the CEO, both of these men were completely non-theistic in their thinking. I was hosted by a Chinese businessman who's become a close friend, and my wife sitting next to me. And they asked me, what do you normally speak on? I said, well, sometimes in schools I'll speak on ethics and so on, trying to find some common ground. Do you know what the president of the business school in Paris told me? One of the best in all of Europe. He said, we don't teach ethics in our school. I said, really? So conversation changed. A few minutes later, we were talking about the election coming up in which Hollande was going to win. He said, you know, we had 3 of our graduates running, but they all knocked themselves out. One was an alcoholic, one was a womanizer, and the third was arrested for corruption. And my wife leaned over and said, maybe they should be teaching ethics in their schools. I said, the whole issue, what do you compromise? Now, when I think of a principle like that, you know, not to jeopardize the sacred right of another, as far as I know, I haven't sold my soul to anybody in my travels. I haven't sold my convictions, as far as I know that. But then I look back after 4 decades on the road and I see my children now grown up and 3 little grandchildren. And I say to myself, boy, they're now adults. The 18 years came and went so soon. Did I sacrifice them as I was about what I thought was a noble profession? Most of our problems that are going on in our cities, because there's not a father or a mother there to give them the values and give them the ethics that helps a young man to be a gentleman and a young woman to grow up to be a young lady, so that they know what virtue is all about and what respect is all about, and the way you speak to people and the way you treat your fellow human being. This stuff has to be done at home. That's how we produce leaders. This stuff has to be done at home. You produce a young man and a young woman who carries with dignity that life. And so, as I leave this with you as my second thought, I just want to look at this thought and close with a final idea. Dr. Minathan Meyer, talking about businessmen, say this: We are convinced that many people choose happiness but still do not obtain it. The reason for this is that even though they choose to be happy, they seek for inner peace and joy in wrong places. They seek for happiness in materialism and do not find it. They seek for joy in sexual prowess but end up with fleeting pleasures and bitter long-term disappointments. They seek inner fulfillment by obtaining positions of power in corporations and government or even in their own families by exercising excessive control. But deep inside they are unfulfilled. I've had millionaire businessmen come to my office and tell me they have big houses, yachts, condominiums in Colorado, nice children, a beautiful mistress, an unsuspecting wife, secure corporate positions, and suicidal tendencies. They have everything this world has to offer except one thing, inner peace and joy. They came to my office as a last resort, begging me to help them conquer the urge to kill themselves. Why? The answers are not simple. The human mind and emotions are a very complex, dynamic system. I don't know Tiger Woods, but I watched his interview after he spoke to the press for the first time, and my heart really went out to him. Nobody wants to be just that shattered, especially in public. And one of them looked at him and said, which I thought was quite ironic coming from the media, they looked at him and said, "How could you lie to so many for so long?" I've had a question for some of them as well. How could you lie to so many for so long? Woods answered the only way he could have properly answered. He said, because I first lied to myself. I don't know him, but if I had a chance, I'd say, Tiger, what were you lying to yourself? What were you saying? It's possible he could have said, that I'd never get caught. But I would like to hear him say, I thought that's where my happiness lay, and it wasn't there. Stolen waters are not sweet. They have a bitter aftertaste. You must not jeopardize the sacred right of anyone else. And lastly, it is a beautiful little verse from Solomon himself, and he makes this simple comment: if you find honey, eat just enough, too much of it, and you will vomit. Well, not a very aesthetic sounding verse. If you find honey, eat just enough of it, too much of it, and you will vomit. What is he talking about? A balanced life. You must balance the spirit, the material, success, humility, power, surrender, family, public place, and the arena. You must have a balanced life. And as I bring this to a close, I have just two things with which to apply. Both of them have to do with relationships because of where Ayakoka left us, and then I close. It is this. An Olympic medalist phoned me one day from 2,000 miles away from Atlanta and said, I want to come and see you. I recognize the name. He flew in. Solidly built guy. Powerfully built. He said, do you know who I am? I said, yes, sir, I sure do. He said, can we go and have lunch? I had no idea why he'd come. Absolutely no idea. He started talking about the books and the radio program and all that were ministering to him. I was very encouraged by that. He said, do you know why I'm here? I said, no. He said, Ravi, from the time I was 12, my goal in life was to win the gold in the Olympics. I bought myself a camera. I filmed the world champion stride by stride by stride. And when the Olympics finally came for me to take part in my event, I was still a few seconds off the mark, and my coach never thought I was going to make it, but somehow I got selected. I started shattering all records in my heats, and all of a sudden, I was in the final. And millions of people were watching and cheering me on. I couldn't believe this moment had come. From the age of 12, my dream was about to come true, and the way I'd been performing in the heats, I was now being tipped to win the gold. He said, something happened just before the bullet was sounded. He said, for a fraction of a moment, I lost my concentration because I asked myself the question, I wonder if my father is watching. Because his dad always told him he was wasting his time, he was never going to succeed and never came for the Olympics. And the thought is my daddy watching. So the gun was sounded, I lost a stride. And I ended up with the bronze. I said, that's not too bad, is it? He said, no, sir, but I'd give it up for the love of my father. I'd give it up to be recognized by my dad. Switch gears. My grandson is 3 years old Jude. He can talk a mile and a half. Somebody once said to Winston Churchill, "I've never told you about my grandchildren, have I?" He said, "No, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it." But here's Jude. About 2 weeks ago, his mother was going through a rough time through the day, and he goes over to her, opens her palm, kisses her palm, and says, "Mommy, I'm giving you my love. I'm giving you brave. Be brave." And she went through the day. He had to start going to school the next week, and he's crying his head off. He didn't want to go to school. So Naomi, my daughter, opens one palm, kisses it, and says, "Sweetheart, I'm giving you brave." And then she opened the other palm and said, "And I'm giving you love." She said, "Dad," when he got out from the car with his little backpack on his shoulder, he was clenching both of these fists and walking into the school, brave in one hand and love in the other. She said, "I had to pull over on the side of the road and just cry my heart out." Ladies and gentlemen, have courage. Be strong when you're doing that which is right and walking. But understand there's somebody who really loves you. That's God, our Heavenly Father, who gave His Son to shed His blood for your redemption and mine. Matthew Paris, the atheistic writer from England, writing in the Times of London, wrote an article. I've got the whole article with me. It shocked the British readership. He said, "I'm a confirmed atheist. Absolutely confirmed atheist." And you know, because that last line was so powerful, I think I want to read just that for you. Give me a moment. I'm sorry, I'm still a BlackBerry guy. And the reason is, I write. And I know that this will be a closing comment that I think will meet many of you in your situations. Here it is. And as he ends that article, he says this. He says, "I'm shocked at what I'm saying as an atheist. Totally shocked." He said, "But I want to say this. If Africa is going to run tall in this next century of ours," he said, "it is not going to be the NGOs. It's not just going to be charity. It is going to take the gospel." He said, "The change of heart is the only thing that is going to change this continent." And he goes into detail. He said, "I'm stunned at myself saying what I am, but I've just returned from there." Talks the swagger of the big tribal system and so on. And he says how critical it is that the heart of humanity be changed. And he said, "I know of no other way except the gospel of Jesus Christ that will change." And then he ends this in this brilliant paragraph. "And I'm afraid the worldview there has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete." I don't think it's just Africa, it's the whole world. Otherwise, it'll leave us with a malign fusion of extraordinary ability and unmitigated evil. The heart of humanity has to change. For that, I know only the gospel that can do that.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010.
My honor to be with you here at Princeton. When I was in Germany.
India, very close to Bangladesh.
George Washington University.
The Middle East.
Meetings in Angola prison.
United States.
From China.
In Canada.
In the United Kingdom.
In Istanbul, in Ankara, and Izmir.
Romania.
At American University.
In the University of Harvard. Manila in the Philippines.
Perth, Australia.
To South Africa.
In Africa.
To Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Singapore. The mission of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries is really to reach the thinker and the skeptic, to answer the questions, and do evangelism undergirded by apologetics, in clearing all of the obstacles that stand in the way so that the questioner can take a direct look at the cross of Jesus Christ. We put it simply, it is to help the thinker to believe and the believer to think. In short, we are in their arena, bringing the gospel of Christ to help them traverse the longest journey in life, the journey from the head to the heart. The fivefold thrust of RZIM has always been first and foremost evangelism. We do evangelism undergirded by apologetics. Apologetics is not the main course. It is the seasoning. The gospel is the main message. So we do evangelism. We do it with apologetics, understanding the questions of people. We are involved in training people where they are and within the church, and training our young to be able to answer the questions that are being asked of them. And then spiritual disciplines, because we never want to forget the heart that has to be touched and reached. So we've got evangelism, apologetics, training, and spiritual disciplines. But there is a fifth very important component. And to switch metaphors for just a moment, it was Francis Schaeffer who said evangelism has to walk on 2 feet. Evangelism is the proclamation, compassion and mercy ministries is the other foot with which you walk into arenas. So Wellspring International is the humanitarian arm of RZIM, which is apologetics with a touch. These 5 components of evangelism, apologetics, training, spiritual disciplines, and the humanitarian need. These are the issues that really carry us into various settings. RZIM historically has focused on 4 major groups: the academic, the business, the political, and the arts, because we believe these 4 arenas really shape the ethos and the values of a culture. Now, obviously, we get into many other groups. We do a lot of work in churches or groups and gatherings where people want to discuss such issues. But we think clearly that when you're in the academic arena or the business arena or the political arena or the arts, these ones so overtly affect culture that we want to be in those settings. You know, very recently I was being interviewed by a major magazine, and he said something that really, really encouraged me. He said, you know, when I think of your team and I think of the approach you all take, he said, your focus is on 2 major methods. Number 1, you focus on the beauty of the gospel and you respect the listener and the questioner. I said to him, you could not have encouraged my heart more in any question than just that, because that's what we really try to do as a team. You know, and the Bible says to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The gospel is a beautiful story. It's a story not just told as fact, but it is told in the attractiveness of who Jesus Christ is and what his forgiveness and grace and transforming power mean. But you can never proclaim that without respecting the honest questioner and listening to them carefully. Have you noticed how Jesus engaged the woman at the well, for example, listening to her so carefully and systematically taking away those barriers that she had raised? And Peter reminds us to set apart Christ in our hearts as Lord, and to always be prepared to give a reason, an apologia, an apologetic for the hope that is within you, and to do that with gentleness and respect. So we retain the dignity of the listener and never compromise on the nobility of the gospel. The barriers to belief are many, and they're actually increasing in intensity in our time. The intellectual barriers. Think, for example, of the overt hostility of some of the most strident anti-theists of our time. Naturalism has become sort of the buzzword of interpreting everything from a single scientific vision. This is a challenge our universities face. They seem to be imparted to again and again that the naturalistic worldview, the scientific worldview has displaced the possibility of the miraculous. All spiritual talk is nothing but tooth fairy talk, according to Richard Dawkins. And so that barrier is very real. We cannot treat it as something minor. If a student is bombarded day in and day out with that framework and that paradigm, how then on a Sunday morning do they sit in church and want to listen to a story from the Gospels to be told as historic truth? So there's the intellectual barrier. There is the barrier of cultural values. So much is in transit. So much is changing that often anyone who claims exclusivity in truth is seen as prejudiced and marginalizing people in groups and so on. Those are issues that have to be engaged with. So there's the intellectual challenge, there's the ethical challenge, there are cultural challenges, there are breakdowns, or there's a breakdown of convictions once held. All of these stand as a block between the listener and the proclaimer. And let me add one more thing. If we don't reach our young generation now, we'll be in a recovery mode for years and years to come. We were warned in the 70s and 80s by people like Francis Schaeffer, Malcolm Muggeridge, and others as to what was looming. The church did not take those warnings seriously, and we can see what exactly has happened. So we have to wrestle with the issues that keep people from putting their trust in the gospel narrative. The global reach is critical because the cross-cultural pollination that is going on. You know, they used to say the East is the East and the West is the West and the twain shall never meet. Couldn't be farther from the truth right now. I mean, on a given morning, you can have breakfast in New York and then end up having dinner in London. And you can have breakfast the next day in Delhi and on to Bangkok and Singapore. And I think somebody once told me that within 3 to 4 hours flight of Singapore, you can reach about 50% of the world's youth. You look at the high percentage of 40 to 50% in their teens and 20s and between India and China alone. An incredible wealth of youth that the world is now boasting that we need to reach. A global perspective is not only that for commercial purposes. You know, go into malls and you see all the same brands and same stuff that is floating all over the world. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the answer for every culture and every generation. We need to reach these various cultures. The two biggest challenges on naturalism is becoming pervasive, and then, of course, the worldview of Islam. How does one live in a time like this without understanding and responding to Islam, which is what RZIM is quite focused on as well. So the global family of humanity is really like what John Wesley would have said, the world is our parish.
When it comes to the issue of suffering and the fact that there is suffering in this world, we have to take that very seriously. I've seen so many Christians who blow off the question and say, we can jump right to the answer. This is a question that doesn't just come from the mind, it comes from the heart, and it comes from human experience. We have to take the problem of suffering seriously.
It's interesting if you look back in the history of ideas, the problem of evil wasn't really considered such till about the 17th, 18th century onwards. And of course it's been trawled out more and more by our new atheist friends these days, being the idea that if there's a God who is all good and is all holy and is all powerful, how could evil exist? Since if he was all good, he wouldn't allow it. If he was all knowing, he would know what's going to happen, he would stop it, and so forth. But I think when we look at it, this argument from evil is actually an argument that points us towards also the existence of God.
Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. And if it is a departure from the way things ought to be, that means there is a way things ought to be. There is a design plan for this universe. And the only way you can have a design plan that is good, that is supposed to be perfect, is if God exists. So the problem of evil really drives us right back to the existence of God. It does not drive us away from Him when we think about it from a biblical perspective or even from a logical perspective.
If God truly has created this world in freedom, then there is always the possibility if it's truly free, for freedom to be both used in good ways and in evil ways. So we can explain the human problem with evil because there are times when humans perpetrate evil against their own bodies, against one another. They use their freedom, misuse their freedom, really, in ways that bring about evil.
What are those people who are suffering? What do they say about this? Generally speaking, around the world, those who are suffering say that God must exist, that He is their hope, He is their reason, and this isn't just a crutch to hold on to. They have seen God come through for the people around them. So, the question, first off, that's asked, how could God exist if there's so much suffering in this world? That's not one that people who are suffering usually ask. Of course, in the industrialized West they do, but generally speaking around the world, it's not one that people normally ask.
I myself lost my husband and didn't in a million years see that coming. I would say that everybody who's gone through grief experiences the absence of God, from great, wonderful Christian people like C.S. Lewis to myself to others. I've read in lots of grief literature that there is that sense that God has abandoned you. So I would say I understand where you're coming from. But I would also say in my own process that as I continue to wrestle with God over it, to argue with God, to pour out my feelings before God, even feelings of, I don't like you anymore, God, I don't love you, how could you do this to me? There is a way in which God is very present in that dark experience, and that's the only way I can describe it. As I clung on, and as I reminded myself that all who wander are not lost, I was comforted by that and recognized that even in those dark places, God comes near. But even in those places, we can trust that God is with us. That's what the psalmist affirms. And I think ultimately our experience affirms that as we come to see grace being given to us, even in those places that we thought we had gone beyond God's grace because of what we were suffering.
But the Christian answer to the problem of evil is that the God who made the world also brought the solution. He wasn't staying detached, as Dorothy Sayers says. He didn't stay up in heaven and think, oh, look at them all suffering, or there's pain and sorrow here, and I'm just leaving them to it. The Creator Himself stepped into the equation, bore the penalty, the price of the sorrow, of healing the universe, of forgiving the brokenness, of restoring the creation. And so I feel the Christian answer is a good answer. It doesn't exhaust the answer philosophically, but it's better than the alternatives, and I would take it as a credible response.
Let My People Think is a listener-supported television ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.